very much for that lovely introduction, and it's an absolute pleasure to be on this call. I didn't catch all of the speeches that have gone before because I've been at doing stuff in my local community this afternoon, dealing with the issues that directly affect people on housing and poverty and all the other things that very brutal government causes for them. The war in Yemen is probably the worst humanitarian disaster in the world at the present time. And if you look at the numbers of conflicts that are going on around the world that are barely reported at all, you begin to wonder why. Obviously, the war in Ukraine gets huge levels of reporting, and obviously the tragedy of deaths and refugees and the deaths of conscripted soldiers gets a lot of reporting. Other conflicts around the world, for example, the conflict in West Papua doesn't get much coverage or much reporting at all, even though it is a very serious post-colonial conflict. Is essentially about raw materials and is also about arms sales, where Britain is supplying arms to the Indonesian government. I give those two as an example because I think it's important that in challenging the whole narrative about Yemen, we also understand we have to challenge the whole narrative about arms sales and the notions of leadership in the world. And I was very impressed with the contribution made by Sam from Campaign Against Arms Trade about the amount of money that has been made by British Aerospace, BAE Systems on sales to Saudi Arabia, but also sales to United Arab Emirates and other countries within the region. Broadly speaking, almost 400,000 people have lost their lives in the war in Yemen. That is more than any other conflict in recent times. Then you add up other conflicts such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and you begin to see this massive death toll that is going on. UK arms sales directly to Saudi Arabia run into billions, but it's also the ongoing income that British Aerospace get from Saudi Arabia for maintenance and delivery of the weapons and the war that's going on. And yet there's something slightly odd that Britain, the UK, was the pen holder for the writing of a UN ceasefire resolution at the same time as Britain was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, arms supplier to Saudi Arabia, which of course was prosecuting the war in Yemen. Additionally, Saudi Arabia consumes 23% of all US arms exports in the whole world. And so this is a massive income that is to the US and to British companies for the supply of weapons to Saudi Arabia, the results of which are hundreds of thousands of dead, over 20 million people affected, very large numbers of children living in desperate poverty, and wholly preventable diseases breaking out and taking further life and reducing life expectancy. And so the ceasefire that was eventually agreed is obviously welcome, because anything is better than the shooting and killing of people. And that ceasefire was then enhanced, I suppose is the way to put it, by the agreement reached between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which China brokered. And I welcome the fact that that agreement has happened, because it does give the opportunity and the space for a long-term peace for the people of Yemen. But what I see here is a beginning of a change in the whole concepts of what is leadership around the world, because there has to be an understanding that leadership ought to be the eternal search for peace, ought to be the eternal search for justice, ought to be the eternal search for environmental sustainability and a sustainable environment for the future for all people, both economic and in the ecological sense as well. And so the support for a peace process in Yemen is important and is huge. And I absolutely salute those such as Aisha in the US Congress and various colleagues of mine in the UK Parliament that have been prepared to consistently raise this. But I have to say this, when you start calling for a ban on arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the effect in Yemen, a whole lot of other forces rapidly come into play and start condemning the individual that has made that call. And so it does require some degree of political determination and strength to keep up with that demand. But a ceasefire is no more than that. It isn't peace. It isn't a solution. It is, as it says, a ceasefire. It's an end to temporarily the shooting that's going on. That must now be followed up with a longer term peace process in which the people of Yemen as a whole decide their own future, decide their configuration of their country, and decide its relationships with other places. But it also requires that the rest of the world rapidly provide the urgent medical, food and technical aid that is needed in order to repair the infrastructure, prepare the education system, repair the health system, and provide Yemeni people with some hope for the future. There are Yemeni refugees all around the world. There are quite a number in this country, and I'm sure there are in the USA and other places as well. And I have to say, and I say this with a sense of shame on this country, that we have done the right thing by Ukrainian refugees. They're provided with support as soon as they arrive. They're given the right to work as soon as they arrive, and they're very much welcomed into our society. And I absolutely endorse and work with them on that. But we're now putting legislation through the British Parliament which criminalises people who attempt to enter this country by boat from France, and they are desperate people from conflicts all over the world. And the lack of support for refugees from the war in Yemen, of Palestinian people, of Eritrean people, of Syrian people, of people from Libya, or indeed any other war-torn country, is an absolute disgrace. And so part of our demands must be full support for refugees coming from this war. And the last thing I'd say is this. We've got a great call here this afternoon. It's fantastic to see so many people on it, and fantastic to see that at last the issue of Yemen is beginning to come a bit more center stage. We need to ramp it up even more, a great deal, to get that aid there, to get that long-term peace, but also develop an understanding that the colonial occupations of the past, the colonial partitions of countries of the past, and the way in which they were partitioned up by dividing up communities, dividing up faith groups, or indeed grabbing of natural resources, is very much at the heart of this. So it does require a much better understanding of the history that have often brought about these conflicts, and the way in which the arms trade does so very, very well out of all these conflicts. So I think we have to understand the power of the arms lobby, the power of the arms trade, the money that is made out of it, but also the resources, the technical resources it sucks up, which could do so much more to bring about decent healthcare around the world, environmental sustainability, and decent standards of living for all. We have to never give up on redialing the process to build a world of peace and of justice based on human rights and survival, rather than the eternal search for war and conflict. And that means it's the citizens' voice, it's our voice, the voice of the peace movement that must be heard, not the voice of those that are making a great deal of money out of these conflicts through the sale of arms. Thank you very much for organising this, and thank you very much. I feel very, very honoured to be invited to take part in this discussion this afternoon.